No further ado, I would like to introduce some people who've really worked closely with Tim for many years and have had close connections with him, who are going to be reflecting again on how far we've come in food policy. Please do come to the panel.
No, I know you fell over about 4 times. Yeah. No, I'm fine with that. Was that a problem? Okay. Yes, that's fine.
In this panel, what we're going to be reflecting on is how far we've come in food policy, what we've learned, and what we need to do differently. The bios for all of these speakers are online if you want to see them at length. But all of them, as I said, have made a significant contribution to taking food policy forward in the last 20 years, and in fact, longer than that in many instances. And they are David Barling, who is now Professor and Director of the Centre for Food, Agriculture, Food and Environmental Management at the University of Hertfordshire, and of course formerly a reader at the Centre for Food Policy for many, many years. We have Liz Dowler, Emeritus Professor of Food and Social Policy at the Department of Sociology at the University of Warwick. We have Terry Marsden, Professor of Environmental Policy and Planning at Cardiff University. We have Aileen Robertson, Professor of Metropolitan University College Copenhagen and former Director of Nutrition at the World Health Organization Regional Office for Europe, and Kath Dalmeny, Chief Executive for Sustain, the Alliance for Better Food and Farming, and alumni, in fact, of the Marsden Food Policy at the Centre for Food Policy. So we're going to start with David. David, please share with us your remarks on how far we've come in food policy, what we've learned, and what we need to do differently.
Right, thank you, Corinna, and follow that, as they say. I think what you're going to find, perhaps not surprisingly, is that my remarks are something of a digest of what Tim's speech contained. But thank you, Corinna, for inviting me, and it's nice to see so many familiar faces here today, and nice to be back at City University after a relatively short time away. In terms of what I was asked to talk about was governance in relationship to food. So what do I mean when I'm talking about governance? I think 2 things I would see as key features when we talk about governance. Firstly, it's a process by which issues become defined as problems. So why is it that things that fall under the umbrella of food policy, why do they become seen as a problem that needs a policy solution? And then the second stage of that really is how we carry out those solutions, the processes by which we take part. So I think that if we look at that, we can see certainly over the last 2 decades that governance has become quite an important tool of public policy and of food policy, and as a result we can see that there's been the state seeking to use other actors to carry out its goals and allowing those actors perhaps to redefine and run with those goals in their own way. And particularly we talk about the rise of private governance in food, the role of the retailers, the large manufacturers, the setting of food standards and so forth. So if we look at those 2 dimensions of governance and we look at how far we've come over the last 25 years, I think we've come quite a long way. I mean, certainly when I joined the Centre for Food Policy, and we're talking about just under 20 years ago, the ground that was being marked out by the Centre then, by Tim Martin, and then more latterly myself making a contribution, was really a ground which much of industry has come to engage on and talk about since, and so has government policy. So I think there's been a definite move. In that sense, the aspect of governance where we define and debate the issues, how we see them as problems, has definitely been movement. And Tim illustrated several areas where that's taken place. So that's a good thing. On the other hand, this has been partial and episodic, and the state, by relying on other actors increasingly, hasn't taken the lead role that it really should. And certainly, obviously, I can focus here on the UK state, as we're focused on UK food policy in particular. But that operates also at an international level. So I think our governance, how far we've come, is quite a long way in terms of food policy, but in some ways it's restricted. What does that mean? What have we learned from that? Well, we've learned that actually a lot of what we achieve is quite partial, episodic, as I said, but also, therefore, it becomes quite particularistic. That is, it's about special interests. It isn't about a systemic approach, although attempts are being made to do that increasingly and to join up the dots. It's been difficult for policy integration, and Kath's going to talk about that, so I won't talk any more about that. But nonetheless, links can be made. So sustainable diets, which is one example which has been quoted already today, is a good example of where a policy link is made in food policy across different areas. But these are limited and partial, as I say. So I think the next thing, the third question, I believe, is what do we do next? How do we improve governance? Well, I'm not sure how to improve governance, because part of my role, I think, as an academic is to identify it and to analyze it, to observe it. To say, well, here, it's happening here. You realize this, don't you? This is what's happening. So it's very hard to say how to make it better. What I would say is that if we think about in terms of our food policy agenda, and certainly the food policy agenda the Centre has developed and is continuing to develop, that we need to think about the bigger political issues of the day. And we need to make sure that what we do and what we think is tapped into that. It resonates with it. I illustrate this in two ways. One is the area where I'm working at the moment. Big issues are ones which we've got to grapple with that are on the agenda. Agri-tech is one, big data is another, genomics is another. These are all issues where we have to think about the social and political aspects which we want to engage in and talk about and have influence upon. And the second aspect is the bigger, so that's the debate side, but also is the procedural side, the institutional side of governance. And here I think Tim talked about the banking crisis of 2008 offering an opportunity, but this crisis is not over. There's merely a hiatus in that, I believe. Germany is bankrupt, and the next thing I was devastated leaving that we voted for Brexit, but Brexit has opened up a whole new opportunity to redefine and rethink our agricultural policy, so opportunity comes from that. But I think I believe that the Eurozone will collapse soon. That actually, as a monetary union, it's going to implode. So there are going to be significant changes ahead, and we need to be prepared for that and think about that and the forms of governance that we develop in order to deal with that. That's what I want to say. Thanks.
Thanks very much, David. Again, quite sobering thoughts there, but always talking about opportunity as well. I'm now going to pass to Professor Liz Dowler. Liz, please go ahead with your questions, focusing on food poverty and food insecurity.
Thank you very much. And I've sent a slide, which I don't have any mechanism for putting on, so thank you. But I'll talk as you do so. Thanks a lot. And thank you for the opportunity to speak to everybody today. I'm going to focus, as Corona said, on something which is variously called food poverty, food insecurity, food and low income, socioeconomic differentials in food over the last 20, 25 years. And this isn't a Tim fest, I gather, but anyway, but I thought I would nevertheless take a minute just to document the role that he's certainly played in this, since he paid tribute to me. I first met him not as a teacher in a formal sense, but somebody from whom I've learned over that period. But I first met him, in fact, in the late 1970s, which says something about how old both of us are, when looking at the structural drivers of health and inequalities in something called the Politics of Health group, which has died a death and been reinvented. And you will see from the slide, I hope, that the first product of this radical bunch who used to meet in Poland Street, pamphlet number 1, no less, is on food and profit. And it seems to me that that's quite seminal. It doesn't, interestingly, it doesn't have a date in it, nor who wrote it, but anyway, you can have a look at it afterwards. And Aubrey Shame, whom Tim mentioned, bequeathed me a great bunch of them when he so-called retired, and I'm willing to part with them for folding money afterwards. But anyway, I was myself at the time largely working in the Global South on the structural drivers of malnutrition, and we were using nutritional indicators for policy advocacy. So I felt I'd met a kindred spirit amongst many others who were at that group, but it was Tim I particularly remembered. What strikes me about that experience is that those working in radical public health at that time understood how important food was in understanding the structural dimensions of the inequalities in health. And I wish I could say that sentence was still true today. I keep hearing senior people who work in public health, who should know better, leaving food out of the equation. Not all, and the ones who don't are here today, but anyway, I don't have time to elaborate these points. And not only was there Food and Profit, as you can see here, and books with Charlie Glatterbuck, More Than We Can Chew, which I've also got a very precious copy of, but not in the picture. By the late 1980s, I was had switched from working in the Global South to work on food and poverty, low income in the UK, and I discovered that the only really existing reports that were widely understood were two others illustrated in this slide, which was done at some speed. Sorry, it's a bit dark. One was Jam Tomorrow, first author Tim Lang, and the second was Tightening Belts, Tim Lang and Izzy Cole-Hamilton, which had come out of the Food Commission. And I built on that for the work I did on lone parents and nutrition and diet, which led to me and to Tim and others being involved with the Department of Health, which was new for me. I'd mostly worked with ministries of agriculture up to then, since that was where food and nutritional issues primarily got decided. It was always a much more important ministry with more money and power in different parts of the world. And in Britain, it had, up till that point, been a main ministry for policy. However, owing to some quite enlightened people in the Department of Health Nutrition Group, in working on the then policy to address wider dimensions of health, they set up something wonderfully called a Low-Income and Diet Project Team, which produced a report, the Low-Income Diet Project Team report. My copy is buried in the mess of my study. I couldn't find it the last couple of days, I'm ashamed to say, because I would definitely have had that on the slide. But a first across Europe and probably anywhere in the so-called developed world, a report called Low-Income Diet, Nutrition and Health and Ways Forward for the Future. And Tim was pretty instrumental in that group. And also in something which was a self-constituted group that sustained afterwards called the Standing Committee on Food and Low Income, which rejoices in the wonderful acronym of SCOFLY. And that was a mixture of civil servants and academics and people who worked in civil society. And we really worked to try and keep alive, this is the late 90s by now, keep alive the understanding of the structural determinants of diet and inequalities. And had a number of public meetings with speakers, to one of which, significantly, as it happened, just after an election. In those days, you didn't know when elections were going to be called, so it happened that this meeting was just after an election in May 1997, and Tim, although it wasn't public at the time, managed to get the then newly appointed Minister for Public Health, Tessa Jowell, to come, not to speak, of course, but to listen. And as a result of that, food access was prominent in the subsequent Aitchison inquiry into inequalities in health, and also in the work of the Socio-Exclusion Unit in the really important Policy Action Team report number 13, PAT 13, you still hear people refer to it, which was about access to food and cost and availability. All of these things which were then crucially being brought onto the agenda. They'd been understood in the Global South, they were now on the agenda in Britain and elsewhere. Subsequently, there was a review of the Scottish Diet Action Plan, 10 years thereof. That's the report at the back there. And again, I've got a couple of spare copies of this for those who'd like them. That is on the web, unlike most others that I'm talking about. where it became very clear that issues of low income are embedded within general food policy. It isn't some extra special thing that you have to have extra special people to work on. Anybody who's working on food issues has to take inequalities into account. And that was quite an important part of that. And it continued on in the work of DEFRA's Council of Food Policy Advisors, which produced 2 reports before the 2010 election, when everything sort of disappeared, really. I've also worked quite a lot with Martin over that time, Martin Caraher, on the role of local level initiatives and public health professionals in addressing low income and inequalities in food access and outcomes, and evaluating those kind of local initiatives. So how far have we come in all that time? You can pick it up from what I've been saying. I think I would agree with Tim that it's no longer a so-called Cinderella subject. We're in the period of pantos. And I don't have time to elaborate the metaphor, but you can do it for yourself. I think low income and food and inequalities, household food security, is variably in the public and to some extent policy eye, both here and elsewhere in Europe and in other parts of the richer world. It's always been there in the global south. There are growing networks of researchers set up across Europe and across the richer countries, Australia, New Zealand, and obviously the States and Canada. I'm just back from a conference in Toronto on that issue. And there are powerful networks now of civil society organisations across the UK. Scotland, I'm skipping over a huge amount here, apologies. Scotland is leading on the human right to food within the UK context, and Wales has the Future Generations Bill Act, which is making a huge difference to the way people are thinking about inequalities. So that's a good sign. We've come a long way. The rhetoric, however, has come and gone, and I would argue we've gone round in a number of circles on how far we think about structural upstream issues and how far we look at human agency, and in particular, how far we blame those who are poorer for their own conditions. And we now have the rather paradoxical condition that on the one hand, those who are poorer are thought to be very good consumers because they're taking advantage of a free public good known as a food bank. On the other hand, they're very bad consumers because they're so hopeless, they have no idea how to budget, shop, cook, and they're really pretty much to blame for their own circumstances and pretty immoral in the way they don't look after their children. That is not my view. I'd be surprised if it's a view of many in the room, but it is nevertheless a very powerful narrative in contemporary society, particularly in Britain. And there are also confusions over deserving and undeserving poor and whether children are innocent in all of this and so on. What I think is really critical is that the circumstances in which people are having to live and having to beg for food increasingly are being systematically ignored by the government, whose own policies have led systematically and knowingly to those conditions. Government policy has systematically and knowingly, and some would argue explicitly, created the conditions whereby people cannot afford to feed themselves. The fact that people cannot afford to feed themselves in Britain today is down to government policy. There is systematic evidence produced by people in the room, published in the BMJ and the Lancet and other leading journals. This evidence is ignored. I am not going gaga. I'm very, very angry. And I argue you should be too. This is being done in our name if we are British. It is true in other countries, but it is powerfully true in Britain. And this is new, I would argue. I think we have now shifted from local initiatives which empower people or seek to empower people, whether they actually do or not, to those which feed and which help people budget, look for jobs, and so on, which might solve some immediate problems, but do not address the upstream issues. What is more, the upstream issues that they are seeking to address are dealing with so-called surplus or waste food. And Tim and one, Corinna Hawkes and Jackie Webster, wrote about this very powerfully in the late 90s and 2000. Excellent reports for Sustain, which I hope is still on in the archive that you can get hold of. So what that has done is it has led to a normalising of unaccountable, charitable responses instead of state responsibility, and it has removed any sense of entitlement and widespread social responsibility. So I would argue on those grounds we're going backwards. We're not going forwards at all. What have we learnt over the last 20 odd years? Well, obviously, clearly a great deal. There has been a huge, unimaginable 20 odd years ago amount of excellent research, both by academics and by those in civil society, often working in collaboration, which is very, very important and excellent. Local authorities have commissioned a lot of work on food and poverty and published really good reports, which are cited in different parts of the world. There is much more voice from the ground. Thank God for that. There needs to be much, much more. And to some extent, there is now more empowerment of those who are living in, I was going to use a rather rude four-letter word, let's use a fancier, longer one, difficult and challenging circumstances about what it's like and what they would like to see. This has produced a plethora of reports, to coin a Lang phrase. I have never seen so many reports. I could have, had I been allowed more than one slide, I would have shown you just some of the many, many, many excellent reports which have come out from CSOs, from local authorities, Fabian Commission, academics, etc. Many times, people working together, looking at responsibilities and the upstream components, and looking at different levels and who should do what. And there's a growing amount of evidence about effectiveness of different levels of interventions. There is the challenge of evidence and how it's used, and I'm not going to say more about that. And I could say more about the complexity, but I won't. That might come up in discussion. What we've also learned, I think, not quite sure who we are, but anyway, what I've certainly learned, and I know many in the room, now I'm sitting here, I can see who's here, is to make alliances across sectors. And that recognition, I think, is pretty widespread, that food insecurity or food poverty or inequality isn't just a food problem or a food sector issue, although the food sector contributes to it in not paying many of its workers decent wages or giving them good conditions. I think we've also learnt to listen better, particularly to those who are living in these tough circumstances and who have different possibilities of dealing with the shocks. And thus we also have, those of us who work in food, have increasingly listened to, for instance, people who work in development studies who are pretty good at understanding resilience and shocks and long-term coping strategies and how you can, how important it is to have policies that don't undermine the ways in which people are trying to deal with the appalling conditions in which they find themselves living. I don't think government is very good at that, but I think many in the room, including those who might be working as civil servants, are better at it. I think we are also better at understanding that the food problems of households and individuals link more powerfully to environmental and economic sustainability. That those are extremely challenging conditions at the moment. Poorer people all over the world, including in Britain, are already experiencing the effects of climate change on their lives, and they're also very resourceful in surviving that. And I repeat, it's really critical that policy doesn't undermine what people are trying to do in order to deal with those sorts of problems. And I think maybe the final thing I'd say at the moment in this slightly too long statement, what we've learned over the last 20 odd years is never to trust progress. There have been a lot of reversals, and there have been new problems, and some understanding has grown, but some has worsened. Okay, then finally, in my last minute, what should we do differently in the future? I think for me, I'm not sure who we are, as I say, for me, in my position, I increasingly am handing over to newer thinking, younger people, many in the room, some I know, many I don't, and people from different disciplines than food and nutrition, which is the one I've come from. I've worked a lot with geographers and environmental and political science and maths and all the rest of it. So we all need to work better with other sectors and other disciplines if we're in academia, and that's quite a hard thing to do, not in academia, not hugely rewarded within the academic world, but there are some signs it might be improving. And we have to keep talking to people and listening and understanding where they're coming from and why they say what they do. I think we have to continue to challenge the idea that it is acceptable for people to be hungry and unable to eat well in a rich country. I think we have to continue to challenge the narrative of personal inadequacy. It has a very long history. I could show you policy examples from 100 years ago, which is why I said, in some respects, we're going round in circles. But we continue to challenge that narrative. I think we should continue to press with evidence for enough money to eat decently. That means people need decent jobs, paying decent wages with reasonable contracts, and then if they have to rely on social security, partially or totally, for whatever reasons, that social security must also be adequate. And we should put no demur of that, of not being able to afford it. And that's not just true in Britain, that's true everywhere. We should continue to push for justiciable rights and entitlement as a framing and not charity. And finally, we should continue to enable others to tell good stories. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liz, for that very powerful statement there, and certainly the showing quite literally your anger at the problems of food poverty and inequality and how really outrageous it is. And unless we continue to feel that outrage, we'll think it's normal. And it absolutely isn't and shouldn't be normal. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. I'm now going to move to Terry Marsden. Terry, please take us through what you're going to say about restructuring food systems. Oh.
Thank you, Karina. Karina's challenged me by asking me to answer the question, how far have we come on policies to restructure food systems, and what have we learned and what would we do differently? So let me first start with policies and the restructuring of food systems. It's a great pleasure to be here and to honour Tim in his long-standing work over the last 30 or 40 years on this subject. I think the first thing that we can say, I think, is that there's always food policy. It might not be de jure or official policy, but there's always food policy. And we have to see, I think, food within this broader context when often there might not be any instrumental policy, but there is obviously clearly different forms of social and macroeconomic policy within which implicate food. And I think one of the things that we started to do in the 1980s was to try to map and locate food within this broader political economy, which is now still highly relevant in this sense. It seems to me that if we look at what we've learned in the past, first of all, that there's at least three sort of phases, I think, that we need to recognise, and they're relevant for understanding the present and indeed, I think, the future. They're highly contested, but if we look back to the 1970s, 1980s, as Tim was indicating in his talk, we were in the vestiges of moving from a productivist system, and the power there, if you remember, lay very strongly with productionist interests, not least farmers' unions and the powerful lobbies of the smoke-filled rooms of Westminster and annual price reviews and so on. And during the 1970s, of course, this productivist fix came to something of a crisis, and we had the BSE crisis, which was particularly significant in that we demonstrated environmental limits. Food safety became a big issue. And this decline in the productivist power was documented by a lot of us during that period. And so in the 1980s, I think, there was a significant period when that fix of productionism started to collapse. Now, what's significant for me about this is that there's a constant here, a continuity in many respects, which even go back further into the 19th century and the development of capitalism and the relationship it has with food production and consumption. And that is, it's very difficult for capitalism to control and manage both food security and sustainability at the same time. But it constantly tries to do that. and it largely fails in the long term. That's what I've learned. But it tries to fix sustainability, and it tries to fix food security. So if we look at the post-war period, we saw a fix there, in a sense. We saw a strong productivist policy, which fixed, if you like, food security for a significant period of time. And indeed, up until the 1980s, when we realized the environmental and food safety issues associated with a lot of this industrial food, it sort of fixed sustainability in the sense that from the 40s onwards through to the 80s, for a significant period of time, we had a period of high farming and we had a period of increased food security. So, in a sense, there was a fix there. That broke down, of course, in the 1980s, and then what we found was in the late 1980s and 1990s, the next fix came by a shift in power in the food systems from those productionist interests to many of the things that Tim and I and many colleagues documented during that period was the rising concentrated power of the corporate retailers and the caterers, which are often forgotten. And actually Tim's work in the 1980s on catering was significant. Nobody really looked at catering. But the corporate development of catering and retailing during the 1990s, and I would argue right up until about 2007-8 in the financial and food crisis, we had a period then which we sort of fixed, or the food system fixed, a system which was neoliberal. It was Thatcherite in a sense. It took the private interests, it incorporated private interests, particularly the retailers, as the new masters in many respects of the food system. But in many respects, looking back at that period now, from the 1980s to 2007-8, it was a period of plenty. Many of us concentrated on looking at documenting the concentrated power of these sectors. We also started looking at alternative food networks and sustainable development and sustainable food systems and so on. But it was a period, of course, which was also associated with rapid Europeanization of policy, the development of the internal market, and in a sense, Europe really looking in on itself in trying to create a coherent, progressive model of which food and food policy became a significant part with the development of EFSA and the Common Agricultural Policy and so on. This is important today when we talk about Brexit and trying to unhook ourselves from this highly integrative process that took place during the 90s, 80s and 1990s, despite, of course, Thatcher's considerable indifference to a lot of this. We saw this integration process developing. That integration process was also about a land of plenty in Europe because it fixed the security and sustainability problem again for a while, only for a while. But it fixed it because what it did was it allowed Europe to create the most sophisticated European market, but also European environmental policy framework within its boundaries, at the same time as being highly dependent and exporting its externalities, environmental externalities, by rapid importing of food goods from other parts of the world. So the fix was a European fix, when we think about it, which is now falling apart. And I agree that actually Europe is now changing in that regard with what David has said. But it was a period of plenty. It was a period when food was increasing amounts of choice through the retailing outlets. Consumer rights, citizenship rights was conflated with electoral politics, and the retailers and caterers particularly provided a major legitimating force for neoliberalism during that period of consumerism built on a very uneven model between Europe and the rest of the world, where we were externalizing many of those environmental and social consequences of that time. And this was, of course, this is the other important thing I've learned about that period, looking back now, was that it was a particular private-public compromise, as these things always are. And when we think about now and the future, I think we need to think about how we recalibrate public realm and the private realm in this new period of flux. What we fixed at that point, rightly or wrongly, with warts and all in many respects, was a private regulatory system which was dominated by the corporate retailers who provided low inflation and a myriad of consumer goods for the population, which kept them happy for a long enough period of time, such that the political system was allowed to progress a neoliberal set of policies. Now, the problem was that that all has now come unfixed again in the 4F crisis, which I think is still going on. I see Brexit as part, by the way, the food, fuel, fiscal and financial crises of neoliberalism, within which food has been a fundamental part. And this is the other thing that I've learned, is that food is not just food. It is food, it is a material good, but it's also a political process. It's embedded within political and geopolitical systems. And we need to understand those geopolitical systems both at the macro level and at the micro level. As Tim was saying, in 2007 and 8, we were doing some work with the Chatham House when the crisis struck, and it was an interesting period. But I think since then, what we've seen is a continuing crisis of neoliberalism, and we're still in the midst of that process. And food, in many respects, is a victim of that process. And what it demonstrates to me is that we've lost the ability to fix the sustainability problem, and now we've lost the ability to fix the security problem. So we've got a double whammy, that what neoliberalist crisis has done has created a massive crisis in unfixing those things. So, for instance, if you look at the European terrain, I think you're right, David, in the sense that what we see there now is a decline in any form of progressive consensus about what the European project is about. It's been surrounded geographically by the boomerang effect of all sorts of externalities from North Africa, Middle East and so on, such that that fix that I talked about earlier of externalising its environmental footprint can no longer really take place. Internally, it's got all sorts of problems associated with its own interpretation of neoliberalism post the crisis of 2007-8. So food and food issues are critically embedded in that process. So there's an end of a UK consensus, and there's an end of a European consensus in that process. I'm not being too depressed about this, by the way. I'm going to come on in a minute to some of the optimistic points about this process. The other point, though, I think, which is very relevant in this analysis, and it's built on Jason Moore's recent book on capitalism and the web of life, and if you've not looked at that, I think it's a useful read. But he talks about food as part of the nexus, yeah? That is a common thing to talk about now. You know, it's not just food, it's about the resource depletion problems, it's about climate change, both effect and mitigation, and therefore what we're seeing is potentially the end of cheap food, cheap nature, and cheap labour. And so we've come to, or capitalism has come to a point where it can't fix these cheaps any longer. And therefore we've got to work out new ways of dealing with what has been the exploitation of ecologies, the exploitation of labours, and the exploitation of cheap foods in new sorts of ways. And I think we've really got to confront, as scholars, this issue of the end of cheap food and what cheap food or more nutritious food means in a market and economic sense. So this is suggesting to me that the public-private compromise and the models of governance that we developed during the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, the never had it so good period in many respects, are no longer really fit for purpose. And actually what I'm now arguing is that the conventional agricultural system, food system in the world is in crisis. It's imploding. And we know that regime change does not just operate with a set of proactive niches changing things in some sort of socio-technical transformation. It's also about implosion. It's also about taking opportunities when current systems start to implode. And what I think I'm seeing is that there is implosion tendencies in the intensive capitalist agri-food regime now, which we didn't see in the 80s and 90s to the same degree. Let me give you examples of that. I'm talking about microbial resistance in animals and human beings. I'm talking about plant resistance to the growth of superweeds. The genomic revolution seems to be an old technology, although they're revamping it in terms of genetic auditing and editing and so on. But it seems to me if the UK was to open the floodgates, this would be a technology which in Brazil, for instance, is now really 20 years old and not actually advancing that fast. In fact, it's causing all sorts of vulnerability problems. So in many respects, I think what we see here is gaps opening up in the conventional system to which scholars such as ourselves and civil society organisations and a new range of, wider range of stakeholders can now start populating in recalibrating this public-private and civil society framework to try to fix, again, perhaps hopefully more sustainably, both the food security problem and the sustainability problems in one way or another. So how is that going to be? So it seems to me that one thing that we need to be doing is developing not only critiques of this, but also normative designs of what sustainable and food secure systems would look like in different territories, not necessarily at national or international level, but locally and within the particular cities or regions or whatever. So what have we learned and what should we be doing differently in this current context? Well, it seems to me that clearly the public interest needs to be reinstated in the sense that the neoliberal individualism and indeed the popular new right, if you like, is not going to be capable of fixing these problems. They are inevitably, seems to me, common public goals and indeed common public pool resource analysis and approaches and designs to this. And this is where I think COP21, the Paris declarations, things like the Milan Declaration on Cities, but also the SDGs, are in many respects global public quests for public rights and global public rights. And we're all neighbours now. This is the other thing that we're learning, is that post-2007-8, in many respects, we are all neighbours. What happens in China, what happens in the Middle East affects us at home. And that's a lesson we've learned about globalisation. But it's also about globalisation of environmental and resource risk, which we didn't see to the same degree as we can see now back in the 1980s, when we thought we could push sustainability forward. Oh, it was about future generations, you know, post-Brundtland. Now we're here with it. We've got 2 or 3 years to try to solve the 2% global heating problem. So the reattribution of the public interest and the debate about the public interest, I think, is absolutely crucial. And I think the work that the Centre here does and the food research collaboration is so important for a forum for that process, because it needs to be public, it needs to be open, it does not need to be privatised or done behind closed doors. So it's no good the government saying, we're going to not tell you what we're going to do for Brexit. We haven't got a plan. They have got a plan. There's always a plan. The question is, let's open these things up. Let's have public debates about it. Now, Brexit, I think, is, rightly or wrongly, it now has to be seen as an opportunity. Let's take back control for national policy. Let's develop a new form of policy. We knew that a lot of the European policy, including CAP, was not fit for purpose. Let's try to develop an integrated set of food policies so that we can try and resolve these sustainability and food security issues. So I think this is a major opportunity over the next few years, both for the Centre here and for many of us. And indeed, it is I see it predicting to develop much more populated constituency with a wider set of civil society organisations that are belonging to the Food Research Consortium and so on in that regard. But I think it also needs to be linked to new sorts of articulations between local and national and international levels of governance. And I don't think there is necessarily particular bias there. I think what goes local can also go translocal, not necessarily the old form of concentrated globalization, but translocal networks and agendas, as we see with many peasant movements across the world, but also in terms of many environmental movements as well. So I think new articulations of using technologies, information technologies and so on, to develop a global propriety around public goods in which food and resource issues become an important part of this. And so I think we need a different way of doing policy in this context, and we need to think about new ways of developing policy. I would argue that this often needs to be place-based as well as sectoral or intersectoral. It's having understood that it's highly integrated, the question becomes how do you develop particular types of policies which allow that integration or foster that integration to take place over different spaces. So we're in a process, I think, of crisis, as Tim was saying, of denial. It's going backwards, it goes forwards, it's not linear. But what I see now is a growth in a wider vector of population and public getting involved in debates about how to solve the food nexus problem and how to make a transition to one which recalibrates the public interest in food policy. Thank you.
Wow, that was quite something. Thank you so much, Terry, for taking us through with such a great intellectual edge the history of what's gone on in the past with really incisive analysis that I think we've really got a lot to learn from for the future. And that phrase about the end of cheap food, the end of cheap nature and the end of cheap labour is I think critically important, and also laying it out in the context of what's going on in the European project. So thanks very much for that indeed. Thank you. I'm now going to turn to Aileen Robertson, who's going to take us through food and nutrition policy. Aileen.
Thanks very much, Karina, and thanks for the invitation, both from you and from Tim. And I guess I although I hate being in London, I couldn't not accept the invitation to come and give what I think is a tribute and to honour Tim and his career and what he's done. And I think the first time I met Tim was in '96 when there was a workshop at Schumacher College, and I had just started in my role at the WHO, and so I was beginning to realise that, okay, if we're going to do something, we have to do something about food policy within the health sector. And then I think both Tim and Martin have soldiered on, supporting me, coming to weird and wonderful places like Archangelsk, where we've seen the midnight sun, or what my husband, when we were on the rowing boat on the pond, and my husband came down next morning and said, we didn't see the midnight sun because we were GMT time and it was an hour later. So Tim and I said, well, we're both going to agree we've seen the midnight sun, right? So thanks for all those fun times and exciting times and mutual support. And I guess within the health sector, it's no secret that food is sort of regarded as being, well, sort of, is that really necessary to health anyway? And of course, I have kind of probably spent my whole career, as Phil knows, fighting the medical profession. And I think during my PhD exams, I had headlines in the local newspaper, starving hospital patients, and the colleagues that I worked with immediately demanded my sacking. And I think Phil said, well, what are you worried about? This is the first time anybody's paid any attention to you, for goodness sake, how long we've been rabbiting on. But anyway, it takes that kind of outrage and outspokenness, I think, to kind of really make a difference. And my challenge was really, how do you get food into the health sector, and how do we make the health sector part of the solution and not just part of the problem. And I often say, and I've got Camilla, one of my graduates today, in the first lecture I say that we don't have a national health service, we actually have a national sick service, because all that health professionals do is deal with sick people and think in a very reductionist manner to a quick fix to make the treatment better. So of course health promotion is still a kind of area that's underfunded, and if there is going to be any cutbacks, it'll be probably in health promotion, and first of all in nutrition. So I then set about saying, okay, well, how have other areas managed to get their agendas onto the political arena? And tobacco and alcohol had actually done very well within WHO in the sense that they all had action plans. So I thought, okay, well, can't we have an action plan in food and nutrition then? And of course, this is where Tim and Phil and many of my colleagues kind of lobbied and battled with me to try and get this on the agenda. And one of the times that I remember, actually Pekka Puska was still in WHO in headquarters, and the first global burden of disease report came out in '96. And I remember that then they said that the top risk factors in terms of non-communicable disease were alcohol and tobacco. And I remember Pekka and I going to Chris Murray and Alan Lopez saying, yeah, but what about nutrition? You haven't put that into the equation. Oh, yeah, but nutrition, I mean, that doesn't mean anything to health. Why should we put that in the equation? And we say, well, I mean, shouldn't you at least try putting it into the equation so that we see how it actually comes out? So they said, well, I suppose we can, but, you know, it's not going to make any difference. And so I'm sure Phil remembers us having to rally around, getting all people to do different analyses that could be fed into the global burden of disease. And the first results from that were then produced in the World Health Report 2002, when lo and behold, wow, nutrition and high blood pressure and high serum cholesterol and physical inactivity, they were all in the top 5. I mean, isn't that interesting? What a surprise. And in fact, now in the recent publication, which was in The Lancet a couple of months ago, they've now published the latest round of global burden and disease, which is the 2015 data. And now out of the top 17 factors, 7 of those are related to nutrition only. And the top 3, one, dietary risk factors is the top factor. Maternal and child malnutrition is the second top factor. And the third factor is high blood pressure. And so I take great delight now when I see Chris Murray at the EAT conference in Stockholm, for example, standing up and just saying how important nutrition is to public health. So I said, well, now you can eat your hat, Chris Murray, 20 years later, saying that nutrition's important. But of course, this all gives us a platform and a basis, as we've all said, for evidence. We need evidence. And this was really the evidence that took us to the first Food and Nutrition Action Plan. And Karina asked me why I wasn't allowed to call it a Food and Nutrition Action Plan, because it was a tobacco action plan and an alcohol action plan. It now actually is called an action plan, but at this time I wasn't allowed. And in fact, the regional committee at WHO, the head of that was a medical officer from Britain under Thatcher at the time. And he said, no, we can't possibly have an action plan on food and nutrition. I mean, that infers we're going to do something. So what we've got to have is a policy. So we can have, and this is the name you can see here, is First Action Plan for Food and Nutrition Policy. And this is what the title was. So I said, well, okay, I'll go with that. What was his name? It was Jeremy... what was his name? It'll come back to me. Anyway, the medical officer. And he used to kind of pat me on the head and say, don't worry. Enormously, the political, I have to write a story about the political aspects of trying to get this through. Anyway, finally, it was endorsed by 53 member states. In 2002, to 2005. So of course the other thing is you have to remember when you make an action plan within WHO, you only do it for a period because you want it to be revisited and you want to keep reminding member states because of course governments change all the time. So I'm glad to say that Francesco came after me and get a second one, and now Joao's got the third one, which is 2015 to 2020. And that's kind of where we've come to today. And so, as Karina said, what have we learned from this? Well, obviously, evidence is vital. And this was the food and health in Europe. This was the kind of evidence that went with the action plan. And we've mentioned the Common Agriculture Policy several times today, and I would just like to mention Lisa Laura's Erlinda's Health Impact Assessment, which Jeremy Metters, that's it, I knew it was Jeremy. He was the Chief Medical Officer who said we couldn't have an action plan because that meant we'd do something, so we could have a policy. So this is Lisa Laura's Health Impact Assessment, and I think this is the thing that kind of can give us the cheerfulness and the kind of vision to go forward, that this actual health impact assessment of the Common Agricultural Policy did lead to policy changes within the European Union, both related to the fruit and vegetable scheme and the milk schemes. So we mustn't lose sight of the fact that we can actually make changes, although we... Oops, knocked off the... Was that supposed to be on? What have we learned? So evidence is definitely vital, but what mistakes have we made and what do we need to do differently? And I guess I have to repeat what everybody else is saying. We've actually created the inequalities. Within public health, we're probably the main culprits of doing what we've done. And perhaps our kind of famous guru, Geoffrey Rose, who said we had to shift the whole distribution of exposure in the population rather than taking the high-risk approach, which of course is true, and I think all us public health people would believe that. But in doing that, and I see this particularly in the Nordic countries, where there is a very universal approach and everybody's got equal access to everything, but the trouble is, even although the population are equally exposed, they're not all equally vulnerable. And that's kind of where we've gone wrong within the policies. So how can we actually look at the inequalities issues, and how can we start building evidence around that? The most recent example for me was when we carried out an assessment of the Norwegian food and nutrition policy. And there was absolutely no data that was disaggregated by education or by class. And so here you've got the Nordic countries that have probably got the most equal societies in the world, where they're thinking, yeah, but we don't look at that because we've got universal access to everything for everybody. But the point is people are not really accessing it. And so I think that Liz will correct me if I'm wrong, that Michael Marmot then in 2010 came out with the expression proportionate universalism, which really means that yes, we have universal policies, but within those policies we have to adapt them to the extent of the vulnerability that happens to be in particular groups or segments or areas within that particular society. And I think that's definitely where we've gone wrong within the health service. And we can see that, in fact, the people we most need to get to are the ones that are most alienated and the most stigmatized. And now I'm taking on the idea of obesity. And in fact, I think we've completely overlooked the fact that obese people can also be suffering from nutrient deficiency. And although it's an awful term, the malnourished obese, I think this is going to be having an area that we're going to concentrate on in the future. And so for me, the way forward is really to look at the life course as a holistic and not a fragmented area. So at the moment, we have obstetrics in one silo, we have pediatrics in another silo, we have preconception in another silo, and they don't actually link up. There's no common thread between them, and not to mention that they don't know anything about food. Paediatricians are probably a little bit more interested because they think it's something to do with growth. But if you look at obstetrics, they're simply totally not interested. And the now growing obesity in pregnancy and increasing birth weights, they're more interested in the kind of interesting surgical procedures that they can use rather than trying to prevent it in the first place. So that's a major challenge. And I think the other area that we've totally missed is taste development. And I didn't get a chance to discuss this again with Karina, but she's written a paper on obesity which says all about preferences. I think we haven't really concentrated on preferences. For me, it does mean taste. And now we're learning the science of fetal development, what happens to taste in fetal development, what happens when infants are born. It's an innate sweetness, and we know if they don't develop that bitter taste right within those first 9 months of life, they're probably not going to be properly exposed again. And the science is there, but we just have not brought that into policy or implementation of action plans. And this is where I come back to food policy. Because just imagine a world where young children loved vegetables. And just imagine going around a supermarket where they weren't going for the sweets or the checkouts, but they say, well, I want to get the broccoli, I want to get the spinach. Imagine if they grew up with that right from day one. And then that's where it brings back to then what does that mean to our biodiversity? Then we could work on the demand for the biodiverse foods and the biodiverse nutrition and the link up between having not a monocropping type food production, but actually we have a biodiverse food production that actually protects sustainability and future development for future generations. And we ensure we bring back a lot of the micronutrients that we've probably actually lost because our monocropping systems. So try to link the whole idea of taste development and a life course approach and biodiversity in food policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Aileen for making those valuable points, and in particular this point that not everyone is equally vulnerable and what that means in how we design and how we do policy, and also taking us through again that past development of the days, and Professor Phil James, who's here, will know full well when you actually said that food was something to do with health, you were laughed at. So we now take that for granted, but it was people like Aileen who were there being laughed at, but continuing to battle for that. And we have her and colleagues to thank for that. Thank you, Aileen.